Hola, this is Dr. Raphael Stricker. This talk is being pre-recorded for February 20th, 2023. The title of my talk is Complexity of Lyme Disease Diagnosis and Treatment, Part 1. In this talk, I will have an introduction and discuss the epidemiology, co-infections, and clinical features of Lyme disease. And to start, I'd like to quote from a famous thinker of the 21st century, none other than Donald Rumsfeld, who was the Secretary of Defense under George W. Bush, who famously said, "We know that there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know that there are some things we do not know, but there are also unknown unknowns, the ones that we don't know, we don't know." And that pretty much sums up what we know about Lyme disease. Now, the reason for all these unknowns is due to what I call the central dogma of Lyme disease, which is shown on this slide. The central dogma says there is one animal reservoir, usually a rodent, and then there is one tick species for Lyme, usually Ixodes hard ticks. There's one pathogen, Borrelia burgdorferi, and then this causes one disease, Lyme disease. And this very simplistic view of Lyme disease has led to a lot of misconceptions about the disease. As shown on this slide, Lyme disease is thought to be hard to catch and easy to cure. Lyme disease is rare and occurs in limited locations. Lyme disease is easy to diagnose. Testing for Lyme disease is very reliable. Treatment of Lyme disease rarely fails, and chronic Lyme disease does not exist. And I think I will show you in the next two talks that a lot of these assumptions are not true. Now, one of the reasons for the misinformation about Lyme disease is the lack of research funding for the disease. And just to give you, to put this in perspective, the annual funding for malaria research is about $137,000 per patient. The annual funding for West Nile virus is about $36,000 per patient. And the annual funding for Lyme disease is about $170 per patient. So this underfunding of the disease has led to a lack of progress in understanding and addressing the disease. Now, the epidemiology of Lyme disease, the reported cases of Lyme disease have increased substantially over the last 30 years, from less than 100,000 a year to about 500,000 a year. And this official reporting of Lyme disease, the CDC estimates that the number of cases may actually be 6 to 12 times higher due to underreporting. And to show you this another way, this is from the Lyme Disease Association. The number of cases of reported Lyme disease tops 647,000 over the last 30 years. And as you can see from this slide, Lyme disease has been reported in every state in the United States. So it's not just the Northeast and the upper Midwest. Lyme disease is everywhere. In Europe, the situation is probably even worse. There are about 1.1 million cases of Lyme disease reported each year, mostly from Central Europe, the red part of this slide. And if you look at individual countries, this is for England and Wales. When you see a curve like this, you know that cases are increasing significantly. And then looking at France, these are the number of infected ticks in different parts of France. And if you look at the eastern part of the country, as many as 43% of the ticks are infected with the Lyme bacteria. So you know that Lyme disease is a significant problem in this country. Now, the ticks that transmit Lyme are thought to be primarily Ixodes ticks, shown here from left to right, the larva, nymph, female, and male tick. The female tick transmits, and the larva and the nymphal tick transmits very easily. Nymphal ticks are quite small, the size of a poppy seed, so they're hard to find. And if you look at the tick mouth parts, this is a pretty ugly slide, but you can see that they're very well adapted for biting someone and holding on and then feeding on them and transmitting any disease that they may have. In the United States, Ixodes ticks are divided into two groups. On the eastern part, Ixodes scapularis is the primary tick. On the western part, Ixodes pacificus is the primary tick, and that extends down into Mexico. In Europe and Asia, there are different tick species. In Europe, Ixodes ricinus is the primary tick that transmits the disease. In Asia, it's primarily Ixodes persilicatus, and there's an overlap region in Eastern Europe. Now, there is another tick that's become important in tick-borne diseases, and that is the amblyomma tick or Lone Star tick, which got its name because of this white dot on the back of the female, which looks like a star. Amblyomma ticks have increased their range significantly in the United States and also in Mexico, and now are found in almost every state. And they do not typically transmit Lyme disease, although there's some question about that, but they do transmit other diseases such as Rocky Mountain spotted fever and ehrlichiosis. Now, Lone Star ticks have been around for a long, long time. This is a fossilized tick from 15 to 20 million years ago that was found in the Dominican Republic amber fields. And this is a precursor amblyomma tick. And when they looked inside this tick, they found monkey blood from a monkey precursor that contained an organism that looked like Babesia, which is a tick-borne co-infection. So again, these ticks have been around for a long time. They're going to be with us for a long time, and they're going to be a problem for a long time. Now, recently, a newer tick has been discovered. The bush tick or Asian longhorn tick was initially discovered in New Jersey. The habitat for this tick is quite extensive, although it hasn't been found in all these areas. You can see that there are areas that are very conducive to this tick spread, and especially in Mexico, as you see here. The longhorn tick can feed on cattle and various animals. This is ticks on a sheep in New Jersey, and they can even feed so much that they bleed the animal dry. And here's a longhorn tick on a chicken in Pennsylvania. These ticks are not known to transmit any diseases so far. However, with their spread, we will probably hear much more about these ticks. Now, so far we talked about hard ticks or Ixodes ticks transmitting Lyme disease, but there are also other ticks, another class of ticks, the soft ticks or Argacidae, that also transmit pathogens. And these ticks have been pretty much ignored over the years. Now they're starting to be recognized as a possible problem. Soft ticks like to hang out in burrows of wild animals. This is a trap with dry ice for a soft tick next to a squirrel burrow in Madera County, California. And soft ticks have been studied in Europe and Italy, and they've been shown to contain several pathogens that are shown on this slide. You can see Rickettsia, Ehrlichia, Coxiella, Francisella, and also Bartonella and Borrelia burgdorferi, the Lyme bacteria. So these ticks have the potential to spread Lyme disease, just like hard ticks. And we need to pay more attention to these ticks. In addition, these ticks tend to have multiple co-infections, and that's shown on this slide, up to 4 pathogens in some of these ticks. And again, the potential for transmission to humans of these ticks is great because they're so-called fast feeders. They feed very quickly and can transmit organisms very quickly. Now, ticks have been called sewers of infection. This is a study from China looking at the infections in Ixodes ticks there. And they found 237 pathogens on average in these ticks. So ticks can have all kinds of things in them that you're exposed to when you're bitten by a tick. And this slide shows the different bacterial species that are in different ticks. If you look at I. scapularis, which is the blue tick, that's group B, and group B has all of these bacteria in them. If you look at I. persilicatus from Asia, that's the purple ticks in group B. And then I. ricinus in Europe is the green ticks, that's group C, and they have all these bacteria, including interesting Helicobacter, which is the bacteria that causes stomach ulcers. So it's possible to get stomach ulcers from a tick bite if you're bitten by a Ixodes ricinus tick. Theoretically, no one's ever looked at that, but it is a possibility. Now, if you look at bacterial distribution, again, Ixodes ticks, they're Borrelia negative ticks, which are shown on the left with all these yellow columns, which represent rickettsia. So there are all these rickettsia carried by these ticks that are not pathogenic or theoretically not pathogenic for humans. If you look at the Borrelia positive ticks on the right, also lots of rickettsia, along with the Borrelia that causes Lyme and also some other bacteria that may or may not be significant. Now, why would ticks carry all these different organisms? Well, there must be some survival advantage to carrying all these bacteria. And in fact, that is the case. This slide shows the different benefits of different pathogens for these ticks in terms of higher fat reserves, longer survival, resistance to desiccation, longer and quicker walking, higher questing, and all kinds of other benefits that are conferred by infection with these bacteria. So that would explain why these bacteria can persist in ticks and then get transmitted to humans. So looking at Borrelia burgdorferi, which is the spirochete that causes Lyme disease, this is actually not Borrelia burgdorferi. It's a picture of Treponema pallidum, which is the spirochete that causes syphilis. That's related to the Lyme bacteria, but it's a pretty nice picture of the spirochete. There have been at least 20 different species of Borrelia that have been described so far, and probably more on the way. Most of these are pathogenic, although the pathogenesis is not well understood. And if you look at these Borrelia, there's also, they are distributed throughout the US, as shown on the left in green, and they share their area of distribution with another Borrelia species, tick-borne relapsing fever, not as widespread as the Borrelia burgdorferi, but also the same locations as the Lyme bacteria. And this, in fact, suggests that relapsing fever Borrelia may be a big problem, especially in the coming years. This slide shows the different Borrelia, relapsing fever Borrelia. The one that's most well known is Borrelia miyamotoi, which actually is transmitted by Ixodes ticks. The others are all transmitted by soft ticks, including Borrelia hermsii, which is the most common relapsing fever bacteria in the United States. And then there are others that are found in the New World and some that are found in the Old World. These ticks, despite their name, usually don't cause relapsing fever. They cause symptoms more like regular Lyme disease. So it's important to keep in mind that a patient who's negative for the Lyme bacteria could still have relapsing fever Borrelia. And this is a study done in California by the Department of Public Health, looking at Borrelia burgdorferi and Borrelia miyamotoi in ticks in California. And you see there's this significant overlap in the distribution of these infected ticks. Borrelia was found in 43 counties out of 52. Borrelia miyamotoi was found in 31 counties out of 52. And then when you look at these humans with these infections, this shows you patients who were positive just for Lyme in green, patients who were positive just for relapsing fever in red, and then the overlap in purple. And you see that there's a fair amount of overlap with these counties that have both Borrelia burgdorferi and relapsing fever Borrelia that infect humans. Now, other co-infections that I'll talk about now, there's a number of them that we test for routinely, or we can test for routinely, shown on this slide. The distribution of these co-infections is also nationwide, as you can see on this slide. There's a lot of overlap in these co-infections. This is a slide from Lorraine Johnson, which shows that Babesia, in fact, is the most common co-infection nationwide, with tularemia being the least common. And then this is from New York State. You can see that these co-infections, Babesia, Anaplasma, Ehrlichia, have been around for years. It's just that they haven't really been recognized, or people haven't paid much attention to them until more recently. So if you think Lyme is bad, meet Babesia. This is a slide from Evan Block, who's a blood banker. Blood banks are very concerned about Babesia because Babesia can contaminate the blood supply. And this shows that in patients who are infected with Babesia without treatment, the infection can last for 2 to 3 years in these patients. And of course, if they're donating blood, they could donate infected blood with this persistent chronic infection. In terms of the transmission of Babesia, this is a study from Pennsylvania looking at rodents and that are infected with Babesia and the Lyme bacteria, Borrelia. And what they found was that 11% of these rodents were co-infected with both organisms. So there's a high risk of getting infected with two organisms if you're bitten by these by ticks who feed on these rodents. And then what does Babesia infection do to Borrelia? Well, it makes it worse. If you look on the right of the slide, the Babesia parasitemia causes more severe Lyme inflammation and a higher level of Borrelia burgdorferi organisms in the body. So co-infection with Babesia makes Lyme disease worse. And it's been known for many years that Babesia does weird things to red blood cells, which it can infect. It causes these tubules that are kind of peculiar, and nobody really knows what they do in the red blood cell. Some people think it's a way to get nutrients into the cell, to the organism, but nobody really knows. This was described in 1974, by the way, before we even had Lyme disease. So we've known about Babesia for quite some time. And then in terms of symptoms of Babesia infection, we have fevers, sweats, hot flashes, chest pain, air hunger, palpitations, and hip pain. Typical Babesia patient is a 30-year-old woman who comes in with menopausal symptoms. And of course, it's not menopause because she's only 30 years old. It's infection with this organism. Now, Bartonella, another co-infection that goes with Lyme disease, can cause a number of different symptoms that are shown on this slide. Bartonella can cause a very peculiar skin rash that looks kind of like mosquito bites, although it's usually not itchy. And it looks certainly different from the usual Lyme rash, which I'll get to in a minute. And then there's the classic rash of Bartonella, which is the Bartonella striae, which are these stretch marks that look like pregnancy, although the difference is that in pregnancy, the stretch marks are usually vertical, whereas in Bartonella, the stretch marks are usually horizontal. The problem with this rash is that it's not specific for Bartonella, and other tick-borne diseases can cause the same kind of rash. So certainly if you see this, you should suspect Bartonella, but it's not diagnostic of that infection. And then Bartonella can also parasitize red blood cells, just like Babesia. This is from the work of Christophe Dehio at University of Basel. And Bartonella can be very widespread. This is a study from New Jersey from almost a decade ago, almost 2 decades ago. And in that population, they found Borrelia burgdorferi in 33% of ticks, but they found Bartonella in over 34% of ticks. So Bartonella was actually more common than the Lyme bacteria in ticks in New Jersey, and therefore certainly a risk for infection. Rickettsia is another co-infection. This is the distribution throughout the US. As you can see, it's pretty heavy in the Midwest and also down through Mexico. And this is animal infections with different Rickettsia species that are also distributed throughout the country. If you think that you're safe from Rickettsia in a big city, you're wrong. This is a map of New York with an area in Staten Island, which is the southern part of New York, where a Rickettsia-infected amblyomma ticks were found. And so even in a big city, you can find Rickettsia-infected ticks. And so don't feel too safe if you're there. Now, Rickettsia causes kind of peculiar skin rashes. These are more scars or blebs on skin. And then, of course, Rickettsia does cause Rocky Mountain spotted fever, which has this peculiar spotted fever rash along with severe neurologic symptoms, and that can be severe if it's not recognized and treated promptly. One interesting aspect of rickettsia is that it can cause rashes on the palms and soles. When I was in medical school, I was taught that only syphilis causes a rash on the palms and soles, but it turns out that rickettsia can do the same thing. So times have changed. And this is a study from Mexico by Dr. Sosa Gutierrez and colleagues from a number of years ago, looking at over 1,100 ticks from 101 sites in 22 of the 32 states of Mexico. And there were potential tick vectors for rickettsia found throughout the area surveyed. And to show you this on the map, on the top are the different rickettsial species. I'm sorry, the different ticks that were found that were infected. And you can see it's mostly on the coastal areas, the East Coast and the West Coast of Mexico. And on the bottom, you see the different organisms that were found with rickettsia in red. And this, again, the distribution was mainly along the coasts with rickettsia and other similar organisms found in these ticks. And then Ehrlichia is another co-infection. This is a map of ehrlichiosis in dogs, and you can see it's very heavy throughout the Midwest and down to the southwest of the country. And you know that if Ehrlichia is in dogs, then it's also in humans, although the human distribution is not as well understood. Interestingly, Ehrlichia can also cause rash on the palms and soles. So here we went from having just syphilis to having rickettsia and Ehrlichia causing this kind of peculiar rash. And again, there's more interest now in Ehrlichia, but there's a lot that we don't know about that. Now, viruses in ticks have been studied, not very extensively, but we know that there are groups of viruses in ticks, and the viruses can be divided into two main groups: the phlebiviruses and flaviviruses. Phlebiviruses are represented by heartland virus, which is found in the Midwest. Flaviviruses are represented by Powassan virus and West Nile virus that can be transmitted by ticks. And Powassan virus is the one that's gotten the most attention. Infection with this virus can cause a number of severe symptoms. Fortunately, the virus is not very common. It does appear to be to have as a main host the shrew, and I'll show you what a shrew looks like in a few minutes. More so than the mice. Mice are a more common host for the Lyme bacteria. What that means in terms of transmission, shrews don't like people very much, so that's probably why it's not transmitted as often as it would be if it were vectored by mice. However, it was thought originally that Powassan virus was transmitted by Ixodes ticks, but now it turns out it can also be transmitted by amblyomma ticks and dermacentor ticks. Dermacentor ticks are dog ticks, which can transmit this virus. So we're probably going to see more transmission of this disease in the future due to the different tick vectors that are available. Now, a few years ago, the Alangshan virus made a big splash in China. This virus was found in the northeastern part of China. It was thought that this would cause a significant outbreak of disease. And in fact, when they looked at the symptoms of this virus, they were all pretty mild, except for the 35% of patients who developed coma. However, the virus really has not spread widely and now is not widely recognized. Filarial nematodes were identified in ticks from Shelter Island, New York in 1984 by Dr. Willy Bergdorfer, who the Lyme bacteria is named after. This is a picture of these worms that are found in ticks. And 30 years later, Dr. Eva Shapi did a similar study in ticks in Connecticut using molecular techniques and showed that there was nematode DNA in these ticks. So ticks can carry these worms. Whether they transmit them or not is uncertain. Nobody's really done any studies of this. Might be interesting to find out at some point, but at this point, we just don't know what these worms are doing in these ticks. And then in terms of animal reservoirs, the CDC has this nice little diagram with different stages of ticks from larva to nymph to adult. But the reservoir hosts for these ticks have grown over the years. Mice up in the left are certainly good hosts. Lizards, shown on the upper right, can also be good hosts. There is one type of lizard, the western fence lizard, that actually kills the Lyme bacteria, but there are about 22 other species of lizards that are very good hosts for these ticks and for the bacteria. And so this is a concern as a host. Now, you want to know what a shrew looks like. It's on the lower left. They're pretty nasty animals, and they don't like people, so they tend to hide out. And then on the lower right, you have gray squirrels, and gray squirrels have become a significant host for ticks in California and for the Lyme bacteria. This shows you the western gray squirrels in the northwestern part of the state, and up to 50% may be infected with the Lyme spirochete. And this corresponds to a high infection rate in humans in those areas who may be getting the disease via these squirrels or ticks feeding on these squirrels. Deer are also a significant part of the Lyme cycle. These are my kids chasing after some deer in Yosemite National Park many years ago. Deer do not get infected with Borrelia, but they kind of act as the transportation and bed and breakfast for ticks. The reason why deer have become so important is that in 1900, the number of deer in the country was estimated to be about 500,000. By the year 2000, the number of deer had grown to 35 to 40 million. So that's a lot of deer to carry around Lyme bacteria. Now, deer have these kind of funny flies, these biting flies called deer kids that have been known to carry the Lyme bacteria. It's not known whether they can transmit it, but this is also an interesting aspect of deer. And you thought that Lyme disease was only a deer problem. Reptiles are certainly a problem in terms of the Lyme bacteria. This is a python from Australia with a whole bunch of ticks feeding on it. Generally, snakes will only allow ticks to feed on them when they're sick, but they can be hosts for the Lyme bacteria. And then another reptile, this is a crocodile from Singapore that has a tick sitting on its head and feeding on its head there. And these are another potential host for the Lyme bacteria. Wild hogs can also harbor the Lyme bacteria and can be hosts for ticks, as shown here. And black bears can also be a host for these ticks and can carry the Lyme bacteria. Now, birds have been known to be hosts for Lyme bacteria and for ticks for many years. This is a finch that's infested with bird ticks, another Ixodes species. In Canada, the work of John Scott has shown very elegantly that birds, migratory songbirds, can disperse millions of infected ticks across the country, and people and domestic animals can contract Lyme disease outside of the known and expected range due to these migratory birds. Dr. Scott's latest work was looking at amblyomma ticks, and this is a songbirds carrying these ticks in Canada. This is not a Lone Star tick. This is a different species of amblyomma, but it can also be infected with tick-borne pathogens. So this is another risk for people in Canada from their migratory songbirds. And then dogs, of course, everybody knows dogs are man's best friend, but dogs can also expose humans to the Lyme bacteria through ticks that like to feed on them. This is a study done a number of years ago looking at dog versus human cases of Lyme disease, and it shows you how underreported Lyme disease is. For example, if you look at the state of Colorado, there were almost 1,000 cases of dog Lyme disease in Colorado, but there was one human case. So you know that the human cases must be underreported if there's 1,000 to 1 ratio of dog to human Lyme cases. And then ticks are very easy to see when you see them up on the screen like this, but in fact, they're usually quite small. This is a nymphal tick feeding on the arm of a Lyme researcher. The way that we look for ticks is with something called flagging, where you use this white sheet and pick up ticks from vegetation. And again, these ticks can be tiny and hard to see. And ticks can also burrow under the skin, and you may not see them before they do that. And also they can attach in places like behind the ear where it's hard to see them. Now, this is a study of where ticks attach, and interestingly, the thigh was the most common location in this study. The foot was the least common location. It's not clear why ticks like some parts of the body and not others. That might be an interesting study to do. Here is a tick attached to the eyelid of an 8-year-old girl, and it's feeding merrily away. And then this is a tick that got into the ear canal of a 9-year-old boy and was found on the eardrum after causing a lot of pain to this child. So ticks can get into strange places and attach in different parts of the body. Now, in terms of transmission of Lyme disease, in 2011, the Infectious Disease Society of America website said that a tick has to be attached to the skin for at least 2 days to transmit the Lyme bacteria. But we now know that this is wrong. The late Dr. Ellie Hinote and Phyllis Mervine and I did a study a number of years ago showing that ticks can transmit the Lyme bacteria within 12 hours and sometimes even faster than that. This is from an older study showing that, yes, 2 days is a common time for Lyme transmission, but even as early as an hour or so, the Lyme bacteria can be transmitted after a tick bite. And this is a study from Georgia that looked at rickettsia transmission. And here, again, 13% of patients infected with rickettsia had been exposed for 1 to 12 hours, so much less than the 2-day time that some people believe it takes to transmit these diseases. Now, the clinical features of Lyme disease, here's the typical bullseye rash. Lyme disease has multi-system manifestations as shown on this slide. The staging of Lyme disease has gone through several permutations. The staging system I like is just the simple acute and chronic disease, acute being less than 1 month since infection, chronic being greater than 3 months since infection, and this corresponds to other terms that were used in the past. In terms of the symptoms, there are patients with predominant musculoskeletal symptoms, and then patients with predominant neurologic symptoms, and this is another way of distinguishing these types of patients. And then there are patients with cardiac manifestations, which we don't see very often on the West Coast. That's mostly an East Coast phenomenon. And these can be severe in some cases, as I'll show you. Now, the Lyme rash, the erythema migrans bullseye rash, is usually not a bullseye. In fact, only about 10% of patients with Lyme rashes will have a bullseye morphology like you see down here. Very often the rashes will be polygonal or funny shaped or look like bruises. And here's some more examples of this. And more samples. Sometimes you can see some bullous changes in these Lyme rashes. And lately we've had something new, the COVID arm after the COVID vaccine, which can look like an EM rash, but it's due to the vaccine, reaction to the vaccine. And then arthritis is the other part of clinical part of Lyme. Arthritis involves a big swollen joint. This is actually not a Lyme infection. This is arthritis due to gonorrhea, but it can look like this with Lyme. So the classical features of Lyme disease involve a tick bite, the erythema migrans rash, and arthritis, but only 50 to 60% of Lyme patients will recall a tick bite. Only 35 to 60% ever see a rash, and only 20 to 30% of Lyme patients get actual joint swelling. So these classic features of the disease are relatively uncommon, and this makes the diagnosis of Lyme disease rather challenging. Now, in terms of neurological findings, this was a study from 1979, a long time ago, showing all the different neurological symptoms and signs that are associated with Lyme disease. So there's a whole bunch of these. The one that's the most significant is Bell's palsy, which is a left facial nerve palsy, as shown on this slide. Bell's palsy is a significant symptom of Lyme, and if you have it, then it's likely that you have the infection. However, most patients with Lyme disease do not have this type of neurologic symptom. They'd be much more likely to look like this. Yes, George W. Bush did have Lyme disease, which he got probably at Camp David, Maryland, although some people think he got it on his ranch in Texas. He never made he never said a lot about his disease, which is unfortunate because he could have been a spokesperson for the illness, but he never did. So in terms of neurologic symptoms, brain fog is a more common symptom of Lyme, problems with cognitive and memory function. And this is something that's seen more consistently in the disease. Now, the way to analyze neurologic disease with Lyme infection, probably the best scanning procedure is the SPECT scan, single photon emission computed tomography. And this type of brain scan looks at the outside and the inside of the brain. So on the outside of the brain, normally the brain is very smooth and, curved like this. With Lyme disease, you see these kind of holes in the brain where there are deficits in neurologic function. Looking at the surface of the brain, when you look at the inside of the brain, in a normal person, you see a lot of activity in the visual cortex, which is back here, but the rest of the brain looks pretty calm with this blue background. Now, in a patient with neurologic Lyme disease, you'll see something like this. This is kind of the brain on fire. Everything is firing and going off. And you can imagine that it's kind of hard to think when you've got all this inflammation going on in the brain. And this is characteristic of what Lyme disease does to the neurologic system. It's known that this type of process can be seen with Alzheimer's patients, and it's now thought that a number of infectious agents can cause brain dysfunction and leading to Alzheimer's disease. The work of Alan MacDonald is very interesting. He's found spirochetes in autopsy material from patients with Alzheimer's brains. And this is an area of research that has grown over the years and is very interesting in terms of having an infectious etiology of Alzheimer's disease that is treatable. For cardiac manifestations, as I mentioned, they can be severe. This is Dr. Neil Spector, who was an oncologist who was ended up with a heart transplant because of cardiac involvement with Lyme disease. He wrote a book that's a fantastic read about his disease, and sadly he passed away relatively recently due to complications of his disease. So cardiac disease can be rather significant with Lyme. And even with younger patients, you can see things like heart block, which can cause cardiac arrest, and this can also be significant. Now, I'd like to touch on one other area, and this is a dermatologic manifestation of Lyme disease. This is an article from a number of years ago about Mary Lato, who was a lab technician whose son developed these weird lesions, and she went to a bunch of doctors who didn't know what was going on. And finally, she did her own research, and she found this disease called Morgellons disease, which was described in the 17th century by an English physician in France. And basically, Morgellons disease involves skin lesions on any part of the body with crawling sensations and also these weird fibers coming out of the skin. And there is an association between this dermatologic disease and Lyme disease and other tick-borne infections. To show you what Morgellons looks like, these are these kind of ragged lesions on skin. And they can often be on the legs, like here. And then on the face, this is very disfiguring. And then there are these fibers that are seen under the skin that have different colors and different forms. And if you look at the skin in these patients, you can find Borrelia spirochetes in these skin samples by different techniques. What happens with Morgellons lesions? Well, this is the leg that you saw before, and on the left, and then after antibiotic treatment, a number of months later, you see that the lesions have cleared. So with treatment of the Lyme infection, you can get improvement in Morgellons, in this dermopathy. So now, chronic Lyme disease, I want to touch on that before we finish. Chronic Lyme disease is used as a diagnosis for patients with persistent pain, neurocognitive symptoms, fatigue, or all of the above. This was a rather pejorative description of chronic Lyme, but in fact, it's actually a pretty good description of what chronic Lyme patients go through. These symptoms were known to persist in patients who had been infected with the Lyme bacteria. And this was an article from 30 years ago describing all these symptoms that persist. And a more recent article in patients who had been sick for 4.5 years after diagnosis. The only symptom that was not significant, was not present, were seizures, but everything else on the slide, from joint pain, muscle aches, fatigue, mood swings, difficulty concentrating, were more frequent in these patients than in the general population. And based on that study, the conclusion was that failure of appropriately targeted treatment was exceedingly rare. But if that means that you have persistent symptoms, I don't know how anybody could say that. But this again shows the controversy with Lyme disease. So early Lyme and chronic Lyme have different symptom patterns, as shown on this slide from Johns Hopkins University and also Lorraine Johnson. But they're basically variations on a theme of musculoskeletal pain, fatigue, and neurocognitive symptoms. There is a case definition for chronic Lyme disease that's been written up. It's shown on this slide, and a lot of these patients meet the criteria for chronic Lyme disease based on this case definition. It was published in the American Journal of Infectious Diseases in 2018. And then if you look at patients with chronic Lyme disease in terms of fair or poor health, you can see on this slide for the general population on the right, 16% of patients describe themselves as having fair or poor health. In contrast to that, 72% of Lyme patients describe themselves as having fair or poor health. So significantly more patients are disabled by this disease. And this is more than all these other diseases: congestive heart failure, stroke, diabetes, lupus, liver failure, depression. All of these have less disability than chronic Lyme disease. So the question is it post-Lyme syndrome or is it persistent infection? And I will leave that question hanging for my second talk. And thank you very much for your attention.